All right, I'd like to call to order the March 10th, 2025 Mountlake Terrace Planning Commission meeting to order. Please take the roll.
Chair Batista.
Here.
Vice Chair Betcher.
Present.
Commissioner Morgan.
Here virtually.
Commissioner Thompson.
Also here virtually.
Commissioner Landis.
I'm here.
Commissioner Stenson.
Present.
Commissioner Wu.
Here.
All right, that is everybody. So item number 3, approval of the February 24th, 2025 meeting minutes. Does anybody have any changes or corrections? I am not hearing or seeing any, so we'll go ahead and declare those accepted as presented. Item number 4, public comment. Let the record show there is no public in attendance tonight. Do we have anybody who has signed up to make public comment online?
No one has signed up to make public comment online.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to item number 5, Housing Action Plan and Development Code updates.
I'll take a moment to introduce Heidi is with Methuen, and Mackenzie is with Echo Northwest. They'll be going over primarily tonight the development code amendments that we're going to be working through. It's going to be pretty interactive tonight, asking for if our assumptions are correct in direction so we can continue to work on these materials. So with that, I'll turn it over to them and we'll work through this.
Thanks for having us tonight. As Christy said, I am Heidi Oyen. I'm a partner at Methuen. I practice both architecture and urban design, and I've been working in kind of middle housing scale design and development since the mid-90s. And I also, on a personal note, I have chosen to live in middle housing for the last 30 years. And I was thinking last night, I've lived in almost all of the types except a dadu. So I also bring this lived experience to doing this code, and I'm really excited to work with you on Mountlake Terrace Middle Code. So tonight our goal is to really seek your guidance on the middle housing code approach. Through the comp plan process, you rezoned your residential neighborhoods into 4 new R zones, allocating where certain densities and heights should occur in the city. And this is a great start. But our job now...
currently not presenting your slides.
How do we do that? Seems obvious now. Thanks. This is not the right one.
And we're back to the incorrect one.
Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so you've gotten a great start at setting where the zones are, the 4 R zones, and our job now is to create or revise the development standards and design guidelines for the 4 zones to include state compliant middle housing that uniquely fits Mountlake Terrace. So we'll be redoing chapters 19.3 RS and 19.35 RM. in your zoning code. Now I can't advance pages. Okay, there we go. Okay, because we have a tight timeline and tighter still, because we're taking time with technology. So we have about 3 months to adopt the new code. And so tonight I'm going to skip over the high level middle housing code topics because I know you've been talking about those already, and we'll jump right into the meat of the code. Christy said this can be a back and forth conversation. So I'm going to present information in several segments and then ask for your feedback along the way while ideas are fresh. We provided the packet last week that includes concepts and questions that I'll follow along tonight. We'll talk about the state requirements and show you precedents from other cities. We'll discuss housing types you think Mountlake Terrace should encourage. We'll dive into detail about how to measure density in each zone, as well as things to incentivize or bonus. Discuss the method to set scale standards, and then end with a discussion about the overall organization of the code and miscellaneous standards if we have time. And Mackenzie will talk about next steps after that. Okay. So the state requirements, I know you've had briefings about House Bills 1110 and 1337. Generally, middle housing is meant to provide housing at a scale between single-family houses and larger apartment buildings. It's meant to offer more choice and often more affordability than single-family homes, and it's meant to fit into the character of single-family neighborhoods. At a high level, the middle housing bill sets density requirements per lot of at least 2 units or 4 units within a quarter mile of transit, or if one of them is affordable. They require you to choose at least 6 out of 9 housing types. It also puts caps on the parking minimums you can require. And then House Bill 1337 requires at least allowing 2 ADUs on all lots and has other standards that I'll go over. I'll go over in more detail as we move on. Okay. So let's look at some code framework precedents. This is a code that Echo Northwest and Methuen worked on for Tacoma, and they have 3 new urban residential zones that just kicked off in February. They are organized by density and scale per zone. They give bonuses of density and scale in exchange for affordable housing and retaining existing buildings, because retaining existing buildings is what they heard from their community that they wanted to do. They allowed ADUs to count towards that density. And then we created 5 form-based housing types that essentially became their design standards. They also worked on tree canopy because trees were something their community heard about it. These are the housing types. I'm going to go through them a little later, but essentially none of them repeat the HB 1110 housing types. And they're not just focused on the buildings, they're really focused on what the buildings and the lots are doing together as a whole. Spokane has been very successful in middle housing. They had a middle housing code before HB 11 came into existence. They have 5 residential zones, 3 at that time were targeted for middle housing. And then the development standards are specific to the housing types for each zone. And so these are a couple of the examples where they really show what you can do for each of these housing types and include some form-based graphics to describe that. Seattle is coming out with their new residential code soon, but they've had mid-scale zones for a while, or low-rise zones for a while. Cottage housing, row houses, townhouses, and apartments. They have varied development standards by housing type. I'm not going to show all the details, but essentially the floor area ratio changes with the housing types and with the zones. But then the design standards or the look and feel are really specific to the housing types themselves. And then they don't count ADUs towards their density. So that's on top of what is already allowed. Portland is also getting a lot of great middle housing. They have 6 residential zones. They're organized also by density and paired with a minimum lot size and floor area ratio. And they actually give more floor area when you build more units. And that's actually what the Washington Model Code adopted as well. Something very similar to Portland where you get extra area when you have more units. And as the model code, they of course list all the housing types, and then they also say you have to very carefully define what those types are. Okay. Any questions about some of those model codes that you have? I went very quickly, but any questions or thoughts? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to get into your housing types. You have some middle scale housing in your townhouse zone now, and we've toured around the city and seen several townhouse clusters with deep driveway access, like this development here, as well as some row houses that are fronting the street, often when they're on a corner. We didn't see many duplexes or small apartment buildings, but of course, there are some larger apartment buildings that you're seeing on the bottom right here. And so the question for you now is, what do you like or dislike about recent middle housing development here or in the Seattle region? Very general question. If you have opinions.
If anyone wants to go first. I don't like that the entire ground plane is taken up by cars for a lot of these, like these townhouses with a deep driveway access. I do think that is like basically like a carcatecture form, right? Like it's driven by having to move cars in and out and around the site. They're also tend to be oriented the wrong way, where instead of facing the street and a garden at the back or something, they have, basically built up to the minimum setback of the line and then of the lot line. And then in the future, you'll wind up with a building built right next to it that creates a little tuberculosis alley there. There's also, I think aspect ratios are taking up a lot of the site and not leaving a lot of usable site. Whereas I think some of that might also be driven by setbacks, like, with the side yards and the front yard requirement, it sort of naturally winds up leading to that form of development. And I think what I heard, and I remember hearing from public feedback from when we were doing the comprehensive plan, is that, it wasn't, I don't know if it showed up in the feedback, but the sort of offhand comment I would hear people make is like, I don't want these, big buildings staring down into my yard. Yeah. Like, I think that people would actually kind of prefer a blank wall taking up like half of their yard and then, the building looking back and forward instead of like, down into the yards and then in future, like you shake hands across the alley. So I think I'm glad that you have an architectural background as well, because I think the building codes and the zoning codes kind of play into that both. And I know there's concerns about like fire separation and things like that that are covered somewhat by the building code. So I think that generally the weak point in all of these is site layout, like the relation of the buildings to each other and to the street.
Also looking to see if any of our online commissioners have any comments. Just to let you know, you guys have gotten a lot smaller on the screen that I have to kind of squint to see. So I just want to make sure I'm not missing any of you.
Nothing at this time, still taking it all in.
I think just to comment on like what I like or dislike about the recent middle housing development in Mountlake Terrace, that general question is just, it's a lot of townhomes. I think that I would really love to see, of course, the middle housing code is introducing that variety, but I would really like to see how we can incentivize other types of these other types of housing, that not just making townhomes the most, what's most desirable to our developers, how we can incentivize the variety that we're seeing presented to us with middle housing.
Great.
I would just add to that as staff, I think in part that's been the city's fault. That we've tended to say that we want a variety of housing types, but what we've actually allowed has been more like a multifamily, mixed use, or townhouses in addition to single family. So I think part of why we have so many townhomes is because we kind of keyed in on districts that allowed for townhomes and maybe not for other variety of housing types in part. So just thoughts of like when I see things play out that we have a hand in maybe how that played out more recently.
Fair enough. Thanks for sharing that, Christy.
I would say that a lot of our recent townhome development, whether it's fortunate or not, they've been able to aggregate whole blocks. So it hasn't been as imposing onto neighboring properties because the neighboring properties were developed as well. But moving forward, I think we're going to end up seeing a lot more development sort of interspersed between our older housing stock that won't blend in as well. And I think you're going to see the impacts of that more in how imposing they are going to be, especially like if you were to put a 3-story townhome type structure next to a single family home, or if, as the state's, mandating now, ADUs everywhere, which we kind of allowed ADUs anyway. We'd worked on that years ago, so we were sort of doing our part as opposed to some of our neighboring jurisdictions. But when you see examples in the region now, especially in Seattle, of the type of ADUs that are going in, what's been allowed, where you have these large, massive 2-story structures in the backyard, it really, sticks out. I know that not everybody is going to be able to build an ADU within their existing footprint or even attach it to their existing building, but it definitely isn't as imposing when it blends in better with the existing housing stock than when you have a brand new structure that's pretty massive in the backyard that is definitely more imposing on the neighbor's property and, sort of eliminates our more open space. Again, some of the conversations that we've had as well is concern about tree canopy and loss of open space on these lots. There's only so much that we can throw into the right of way. We're fighting with on-street parking and bike lanes and wider sidewalks and planting strips, trying to squeeze in trees in there and stuff, and we're losing a lot of tree canopy on these lots. So, having a way that can be retained, but it's one of those cases where we haven't necessarily seen it yet, but we're gonna see it. So we need to be prepared or have some sort of remedy to that issue.
Thanks. I'm glad you brought that up because I think there's also like a couple of things that are kind of middle and weird about developments that already happened. Like the standard Mountlake Terrace blocker is about the size of an ADU. So there are a few instances around town where you can walk around and see where they built the big house in the back, and it's kind of weird. And then there are a few others where things work on corners, and things just seem to work better on corners. And I think the most successful townhouse developments have been on corners, elevated a little bit. I'm thinking of the one at the northwest corner of 55th and 234th, where it's got that little barber shop that's on one of the townhouse units. Like that turned out pretty well, I think. Like especially the commercial space, it always looks a bit adorable. And then I also think our cottage housing developments have better site relationships between the buildings. You don't have like the entire site taken up. You kind of have a public space that's already required. And they seem to be less looming over the neighbors.
Are you referring to our updated cottage housing code or what few cottage housing developments we've seen?
The two that we've had, we've got the older one that's like off of 52nd, kind of south of 236th ways, and then we've got the newer one that's east of 48th, also south of 236th. One is like smaller houses, and the other is larger houses. But like I think I don't know if the density is the same as the townhouse, probably not. But I think the arrangement of the buildings on the site are a bit better than having most of it taken up by the car and moving around the car on the ground floor. And then the way the buildings meet the street, like I think the townhouses that have been built on slopes, there are a few examples on 56 and on 50 or in 234th, where you walk up a little bit in order to go into the townhouse rather than just having your weird ground floor house that like your weird ground floor room that no one knows what to do with, like, and the curtains are always drawn up. Like I think that arrangement sort of helps the streetscape.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just pulled up that on that 55th and 234th on my iPad. That does look very nice. If we could do more like that, that's very pleasing to the whole neighborhood. It doesn't even look crowded. Like this one one that's being displayed right there on townhomes on 56th Street. I just feel like that's such a, I don't know, such a mismatch of houses. And it's kind of like I've heard people say already that someone else can look down into other people's homes and their yards, and it feels like an invasion of privacy, as well as just being not very cohesive.
I would say, I know, with some of the developments, I can't call them out specifically, but, I'm sure, staff can work with you on this one. A lot were built to sort of live work standards. But while some of them may actually be used as live work, I think, and I kind of see this across the board. I see it a lot in Seattle. Most of the units that are being built as live work aren't being used as live work, and so it does have that interrelationship between pedestrian and structure that Commissioner Betcher was talking about, where it's always, the blinds are always down, it's always closed off, because while it was designed for live work, it's not being used as live work. And who knows if we're ever going to get to that threshold where all of a sudden we're going to see the demand for these as live works. So it really informs the design choices that are made. And I sometimes think that we've sort of shot ourselves in the foot by, having all this live work when, me personally, I would like to see actual just dedicated commercial space, but I know that there is a demand for working at home, but is it working at home versus a live work type unit, that's open to the public as opposed to an at-home office?
I would say as part of this conversation, that when we did Town Center for Town Center 1, if you're doing what's called, when you're doing straight residential, no ground floor commercial, and we really haven't seen this because in a lot of cases, people vested their developments before we got those adopted. But like you were saying, for your example, Adam, is that there's a requirement to set back and also elevate a bit. So even if you're utilizing it for a residential purpose, the property owner is not having a tendency to shut those blinds because your window is right there at the street and people, are naturally looking in, but you're setting that back a bit. You can have a porch or some landscaping out front and you're elevated just enough that it's a lot more, I guess, cohesive and opened up versus all the blinds. So go back and take a look at some of those standards in the town center district when we're doing ground floor residential. In that case, when somebody wants to do residential, to still see if you agree with those kind of concepts, because I think when we toured around the region, we saw a lot of really good examples of that. We just perchance have a couple of those where people are elevated, and you'll see a huge difference. That first one on the top left-hand corner, that was one that vested before, like that elevation where they did live work. I know that there's at least one of those units that's being utilized for commercial purposes, and they didn't do a bad job because there is a bit of a setback there, which is helpful. But again, I think just a little bit of that setback and that elevation really, really helps in those situations of just that livability of those units and how, you know, people are kind of interfacing with the sidewalk or the pedestrian way. So anyways, take a look at that and see if that's something that we want to mimic in some of these other examples that we're going to use.
Quick question. I know we talked a bit about live work. Are this and accessory commercial units within the scope of this exercise?
Not particularly, like live work, not necessarily is not, you know, one of the middle housing types. And, you know, it was a big deal for, you know, live work. And I agree. It's like in some cases, it's utilized, but I don't think to the degree that a lot of people thought that, you know, all of these ground floor units were going to be commercial. I think if we do certain design treatments, then you get to the point where it doesn't really matter if it's residential or commercial. It still opens the opportunity to have that commercial space. But if it's not the commercial space, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think, you know, Shoreline allowed commercial in a lot of places and just recently, and we've got some examples, and I could see it being something that the state might make us do as well. I don't know if that bill is still in play or not, but I think it might also be in our economic development plan as well, that like maybe this kind of thing is allowable for liberalization. I can see how we could not fit that in our timeline currently, though. So if we don't come to it now, I think it's something we should revisit in the future.
Yeah, and I would say the legislature has been very active in like adopting new legislation before you can get the other legislation adopted. So I would caution us to just not jump at everything that's getting thrown in the kitchen sink right now and say, okay, this is what's before us. I think it's good to think about it, but I also think, you know, maybe we can approach this in a design way, because I do think there's going to be a tendency to allow more flexibility of uses in these residential zones. But I think there needs to be a cohesive way of doing that and what's allowed, because, you know, it just goes back to basic zoning. Do you want the auto mechanic next door to you when you're at home in your residential area, or are some things more fitting next door as a type of commercial use than others, right? So just, that's a whole conversation.
Okay, I have a similar question up here. And I think we're going to talk about housing types, so there's time to answer the last question too. I'm going to ask these and then talk a little bit more about housing types. And when you answer the next questions, think also about what residents want. Are there particular housing types that you've heard people want to live in? More variety than townhouses is what we've heard. Christy's saying, we've heard you say. Okay. So HB 1110 requires at least 6 of the 9 housing types that are listed on the left, and the definitions are on the right. Some of these overlap. So the plex is a residential building with attached units, usually between 2 or 6, and they're called duplexes and triplexes, et cetera. They're labeled by their numbers. Townhouses are buildings with 3 or more multi-story attached units and front and backyards. Sometimes the townhouses we see in Mountlake, Terrace, and in Seattle don't quite fit that definition with front and backyards. Stacked flats are single units stacked on top of each other for up to 3 stories. They could also be considered plexes. And then courtyard apartments have attached dwelling units arranged around a courtyard. And then cottage housing has detached units organized around a large courtyard. Housing types are probably the most intuitive thing of all code concepts. We recognize them based on their form characteristics, such as the placement of buildings or units on a lot, the number of stories, how you enter the units. We understand these because we've seen them a lot. The tricky part is that they can get the housing types can be conflated a little bit, right? So as talking about the triplex is also, could also be townhouses, et cetera. Okay, so our key questions, and think about what residents want as well as you're answering this, is what housing types should be allowed in Mountlake Terrace? And should some be encouraged more than others? And then what might need to be illustrated for key stakeholders about those housing types to make a final decision on them? And so, you know, you've commented on what you like and you don't like, but what would the direction be on what you would like for your housing types? Now, I do have a couple slides that I could go, let me go through a couple. I can tell you guys like to talk, which is great. This is really, really, really great. So I'm going to pose a couple options, and they're not from HB 1110. You're going to see that's not that 9 types because they can be conflated with each other. But these are maybe a more specific grouping of or ways you could do it. This option is similar to what we just created for Tacoma. The types are organized primarily by their physical form. None of them have absolute unit counts attached to them, but they have ranges. So the houseplex on the left is 1 to 6 units. The multiplex on the right is 7 or more. And then there are different arrangements of units in the middle ones. And then you're allowed to arrange any combination of types together on a site. You can do that. If you liked this one, you could do 4 types, you could do 5 or 6, but somewhere in that range is probably right. When you get too many, it might not work. The second option is organizing housing types into more simple categories of being attached or detached. So you could combine some on a site. So this leaves a lot of flexibility for the physical configurations and unit counts to vary based on other standards in the code. Okay, so I'll turn it back and ask again, what housing types should be allowed? Should some be encouraged more than others? And what do stakeholders need to see?
So I might ask the inverse of the first question. What shouldn't be allowed? Because that's probably easier to answer. You know, and I also guess I don't understand the constraints that we're working with here. You know, like if you're optimizing towards something, you know, like, are we framing it as existing residents who would want to move here, or like the future people that will be moving here? What would they want? Because, you know, this is it appears to me that Mountlake Terrace is mostly single-family residents and large apartments. So whatever is the least disruptive with that seems to make sense. But like, I guess I just don't know what constraints we're working with.
I don't think you're working with any constraints. I think to assume that everybody wants apartments or single family would be based on the assumption that that's really what zoning's allowed, right? That's very traditional 1960s, 70s, 80s zoning. You know, we have the single family neighborhood, and then we have the multifamily neighborhood. And then you can see here in Mountlake Terrace, then we got a little risky and we did the, you know, the townhouses. We're not unlike most jurisdictions. So I would just caution to say, just because we see certain forms here, that's because we allowed certain forms here. I'll just say when I talk to people and they're looking for a smaller type unit, they're looking for a variety, which is what we've said in our comp plan for basically the last 30 years, I believe, a variety of housing types. But we really haven't had mechanisms in place for that to happen. And so I think in my world, it's more about allowing maybe more types of housing types that weren't, it's not necessarily 6 new housing types, but maybe of where we allow them, we constrain that a little bit. And what I mean by that is we have the R1 through 4 district. maybe we're a little bit more conservative in the R1 district, which is primarily single-family homes. And maybe we say, in that zone, we're going to be a little bit more conservative. But by the time we get to the R4 zone, you know, gloves are off and, you know, you can kind of do, you know, all 9. I mean, that's kind of up to the Planning Commission as well. But I would say, I think we're trying to do both. We're trying to, you know, be considerate of the people that live here in this community and how we introduce this. But at the same time, we're required to, you know, to provide for population increases, and we need to do that. And so what's the most constructive way of allowing for those densities to occur? So I would say both.
So I will say for public feedback, what I've heard is want to be able to own something. Don't necessarily want to have to live in a bunch of stairs. The cottage developments tested very well. They were all, I think, the most universally preferred in the public outreach we had during the comprehensive plan. So I think the, you know, sort of stacked flats and the cottage housing development are probably and small apartment buildings are probably underused. And like, you know, like if you go back, you know, in sort of the areas around 212, you'll see before the 1980s or so, there are actually a lot of these, like, you know, it's a very common type where you've got 4 apartment buildings and you've got the stairs in the middle and you've got like 2 on the ground floor and then 2 on the upper floor. And so like, for some reason we stopped building those. Seems very simple and would address a lot of people's concerns. I think the question I would have is, what makes those hard to build? What types of housing are harder to build than others? Are there some, you know, condo liability laws, thresholds where we started introducing sprinklers and giant elevators and things like that? I think those are questions that I would have, like which are easy to build and which are hard to build.
The microphone. Okay, I think it's on. I mean, you nailed the big ones, I think, especially condo liability laws. As soon as you start trying to make any kind of stacked ownership option, the costs go way up to the point that it's pretty much infeasible in most markets. Also, once you get above 3 stories, you got the fire sprinklers, you have the elevators. That's really a place where there's kind of a cost cutoff. I think I agree. The cottages, they seem to be very successful in a lot of places. Townhomes, obviously, I think we could all agree would be the #1 thing. They work well. They can be built kind of economies of scale with how you can amortize the cost across the units. And you can build them fee simple so you don't run into those condo liability laws. I think you really, though, do need kind of more of those attached units, like you would see more like a townhome scale, to kind of amortize those costs rather than like on a smaller end, like duplex, triplex, even if they're kind of in the same form. Just the economics don't generally work out in a lot of markets.
I know we're a bit cheaper than some of the others because our buildings are old and kind of bad. Do you know if I guess is this part of the analysis you'll do, like what actually pencils out on the lots?
Yeah, so we're going to do a feasibility analysis basically starting right after this meeting.
Okay.
And so the work that Methuen is going to be doing around setting up the code and figuring out what fits, Echo Northwest will be basically doing a feasibility analysis to see not only does it fit, does it make sense economically, how can we add incentives, if not, if those are housing types that we also want to see.
Okay, yeah, I think like I would be interested to see the difference. Like we probably have some survey data on what people have liked and, you know, anecdotal data from us. And then we also have the information on what is easy to build and what is hard to build. So I think that's where we would then find the information on what we should encourage and what we shouldn't encourage. Just as kind of a comment, like, I think the state model code is too complicated. Like like, what is the difference between stacked flats and a triplex with do you put you have half of it be a 2-story thing and the other half be like 2 1-story apartments, right? Like, I mean, you start breaking this down. I think I would like to see like this broken down to sort of more elemental things of how many buildings is it? How do the buildings relate to the street? Do they face directly on the street, or do you have to have some kind of like progression of space from public to semi-private to private? I think that would help us sort of manage the amount of sort of explosive language I could see from trying to create a zoning code based around 9 different types of housing. So if there's ways to simplify it as we're going forward, I think that would be helpful, kind of break it down to its essential elements.
I know for me, since I've been around long enough, when we first implemented, the cottage housing code, it only had the one original development, and they decided to use it as rentals and not even make it as it wasn't even affordable rentals, and it definitely wasn't for sale. That was kind of a disappointment. And then to go more than a decade before we saw a second development, and then that be still close to 2,000 square feet a unit, it's didn't really hit my idea of what cottage housing is. For me, I'm looking at something, it's an affordable alternative for potential homeowners and residents. So I kind of see that, okay, we're definitely increasing the density to create this type of housing development. But I also envision those being smaller units as well. They're more affordable. Again, the one story for obviously those, especially who are maybe mobility impaired, who are just wanting to avoid stairs, or if it's once you get into 2 or especially 3 stories and you're cramming them in like the cottage development, it really just feels like you're packing it in like sardines, and it definitely doesn't fit in with the remaining context of the neighborhood that's around it. I mean, I keep envisioning what Seattle is seeing, where they'll tear down one house and put in 4 townhomes, and it just they just get crammed in there, and no, and they're not affordable. it's like, okay, it's a pure. I mean, obviously, it's a capitalist society. Developers want to make a profit, but I mean, it's like maximizing profit over not really providing affordable housing. It's providing housing for those who could have afforded it to begin with. It's in these days, a house, okay, maybe it was $1 million house instead of a $800,000 new townhome. I mean, I couldn't afford either one of those. So it's,
I agree.
I mean, I like sort of the historic charm of old, like courtyard apartments and, that style. If we can make that pencil out where it's not as intrusive to add that density, and it's of a size and a price point that is actually affordable for people, I mean, that's what I would like to see. So it's kind of like, I want to see that style, but with conditions. And I think you could probably say that with any of the options
All of them, yeah.
on this list. It's like there is of this 9 list here, there is a way I could see all of those working, and then there is a way I could see all of these going south real quick. It probably doesn't help, but it's like these in the right circumstance and with the right conditions in place, I think all of these would be feasible. Maybe not necessarily everywhere in the city, but without careful consideration, it could be really detrimental. How about any of our online commissioners?
like what you were saying. I agree. I like the cottage style housing appeals to me, but my idea behind that too is also something that one you would own rather than rent. And even if it was own or rent, it needs to be, it can't be priced out into the, upper atmosphere. It needs to be affordable, reasonably affordable. Otherwise, I mean, what's the purpose of these bills if we're not trying to get everyone, more people an opportunity to get into a home, not just the people who have money?
Can I ask a question that, if we're talking about affordable housing, are we typically talking about a rental context, or are we also trying to make ownership more affordable? Because most of these seem like renter type units.
Turn that off. Typically, well, there's capital A affordable housing that's regulated, and that is nearly always going to be rental housing, just because it's very difficult to do the administrative side of ownership housing, particularly on city staff or whoever ends up managing it. For talking about affordable housing, that's maybe more what we would refer as naturally occurring affordable housing, where it's not regulated, but it is sold at a lower price point, either because it's older or smaller or, any other reasons that we do see in both ownership and rental housing. We'll be talking a little bit later about next steps, and we'll actually be back in a couple of weeks to talk about the housing action plan that's coming along after the development updates, but as part of this project. And for that, we will be looking at kind of non-traditional ways beyond regulated affordable housing or middle housing to get more affordable housing in Mountlake Terrace. And so those things might include like public-private partnerships or things like co-ops, things like that that are less directly code related, but ways that other communities have found a lot of success in getting more affordable housing.
Yeah, one thing I've seen in Las Vegas, which is where I moved from, is that lot sizes went from about 6,000 on average to like 3,000. And they built 2 stories and they just really pack them in. So you get a little bit of a backyard. There's basically no space between houses, like basically only the wind can get through it. But it works for people, and that's an affordable path to ownership. But it also creates more value out of the land. If you had a 9,000 square foot parcel, let's say you could chunk it up into 3. I mean, that land automatically becomes way more valuable that way. But then the individual cost per unit should be lower. So if we're talking about the ownership context, I would also throw in like land proposals as part of the way to do that, because otherwise, even with something like cottage housing that may seem effective, it still seems like a rental to me, because you have to have kind of like one primary owner, multiple buildings, and then those get rented out.
Typically, cottage housing is home ownership. It's each of the individual properties are owned separately. Same with the majority of townhouses in the city. We have a mechanism called fee simple subdivision, which allows those properties to be segregated. I think what we've seen here is, when I got here 7 years ago, price point for a townhome, for a new townhome was just under $500,000. It would be $400 and some thousand for a townhome. It went as high as $900,000 per townhome, and it's probably settled into rough, high 7s, somewhere in the 8s right now. So what started out is an alternative to single family, of being a little bit more affordable, at least for the townhomes. So quickly, like folks are saying, it's like, so is it $1 million or $800,000? I don't know. If we consider any of those affordable, I think we always have to consider the value of the land in the situation that we're dealing with here. A little bit different than Las Vegas, right? So you're starting out from a space where the property itself is a lot more expensive. And so the actual construction cost, relatively the same. It's when we get to not being able to control the cost of the actual land itself and the scarcity of that. And then we'll see that driving up prices as well. So kind of where we're at right now with that. But there is the majority of townhomes, with the exception of one development, primarily right now is homeownership.
I'd be interested to see that breakout between the cost of the building and the cost of the land. Like, what kind of construction costs are we seeing now, generally, versus the land? And I know, like, our history is actually like affordable housing when they founded the town. But the way they did that was they gave everyone a lot of land and then just made the houses really tiny, like these 700 square foot, cheap as possible, like concrete block houses. But then over time, people expanded them, which I think is also an interesting model of affordability. So is there something like that that could be looked at as well, where you start small and then can change over time?
I think what we'll probably, end up just, seeing as we work through this and, kind of see those figures come back to us is that things like, cottage housing, courtyard style, that is more affordable ownership, whereas maybe we can steer the sort of townhome ADU as the ADU is a rental, which helps subsidize the ownership costs of the primary unit, and potentially provides an affordable rental unit for, an additional, a family member or, not family, just some random person, you're renting it to. And I know state legislation is in flux right now, but having seen it in Seattle and having to deal with it in two different departments in Seattle, I am not a big fan of condoizing lots, where, you build an ADU or you have a home and then now you have an ADU and a DADU, and now you've condoized the whole thing. I personally am not a fan of that. But I'm coming at that as more from an administrative side of the headache that is on the city side of things, of having to deal with it, and the property owners not necessarily realizing what they're getting into, when they're buying that property. It's like, oh, you don't have full control of access to your utilities, or how that works. How in Seattle, how City Light treats that, how SPU treats that, how SDOT treats that. It is a headache and it is a hassle. Personally, I'm not a fan of it. I would rather see it stay as one lot with one ownership. They want to rent them out, great. Hopefully they're renting them out at an affordable rate. But I don't think I personally don't like that as a path to ownership, just for a carved off dadu, and that's all, that's it. That's a personal opinion. I don't know how other people feel. And I guess it doesn't matter how any of us feel if the state comes down in their new legislation and mandates it.
Well, they don't have to mandate it because it's allowed right now. So if somebody's condominiumizing it, the city has no control over that. Somebody can do that right now. It's just been the liability laws for larger condo projects in the state of Washington that have kind of not happened since, the early 80s. Because of people suing each other and all of that good stuff, but in law changes. But right now, I can circumvent the city and condominiumize something. So I think a lot of what we're probably going to have control over when we go through these exercises and just what's been mandated is we're going to have to think about use and what we're allowing and how we're allowing it. And that's essentially what we're going to have control over. And the rest of the stuff is going to kind of be out of our hands as far as what the state is mandating for subdivision. Right now there's some stuff in the legislature where everything's an administrative subdivision, or you can do so many lots and you don't even have to go through a subdivision. So some of those things are even what we've known historically in the state of Washington since 71, 69 for subdivision, 71 for short plats. I think we're going to see very quickly that stuff go away and we're going to have less control. So I think my opinion is we try to focus on the design and the allowed uses, and the other stuff is going to be, you know, spin the wheel and we'll find out kind of. But I think that's going to be less and less under the city's review, just as we move forward.
I would say it's some of the other, concerns, issues that we have that we haven't necessarily dealt with right now because we're not seeing the infill development. We're seeing full block redevelopment is how you're accessing those additional units, how is, what type of off-street parking is the developer proposing. Obviously, we can't force it, with what the code says, but we haven't really got that into that situation yet, whereas the developer has the ability to sort of design that into their project, whereas now it might be a little bit harder and they might just put the burden like, oh, we don't have to provide it, so we're just putting it on the street. You city get to figure it out. I know, that could be an issue. Another issue is not necessarily with the design of the structure itself, or, maybe even the design of the vehicular access, if there is any, but a point that constantly becomes an issue with these type of developments is the waste receptacle storage, how that impacts the neighborhood. There's at least one developer who has proven with what they've submitted to us is that they can actually site that on their in the interior of their development without any issue, whereas we have other developers who are putting that burden out in the right of way. So when you add the single receptacle for each unit for garbage and the single receptacle for each unit for recycling, and there's 20 units, that's 40 receptacles that are getting rolled out onto the street on trash day, as opposed to keeping it interior, or better yet, a dumpster. And I know that is an agreement between, usually it's waste management in that development, how waste management is going to access their stuff. But we have to be mindful of that as well, because I know that has been a big issue every time we see a development and they're just proposing to throw those cans right out onto the street. And, oh yeah, they're the adjacent development as well. So now you times that by 2 or times that by 3, and it's ridiculous.
We just wrote the solid waste manual for Tacoma because this was an issue, and it so affects even capacity of how many units you can fit on a site and how many solid waste containers you can put out for collection. So let's touch base on this, Christy, as we're moving forward.
Yeah, it's a big thing. I think when we redid our townhome standards, whenever that was, Nick, you were here.
Yeah, this has been a sticking point for me for over a decade.
There was a big pushback of staff, and so council let it go ahead. But I think now that we've had these larger townhome developments, and like Chair Batista is saying, we have, you have 20 to 40 units or whatever, that's 80 cans out on garbage day just for that development, then it's become a real issue. And also just parking, if we have less parking and then now we're going to have more cars out on the street and garbage collection, it's a real mess.
And delivery of Amazon and the like. It's just there's no place to park, and the garbage cans are there, and the Amazon trucks in the middle of the street.
That's a really good point. I know we kind of touched that on the last either the town center update or the comp plan, but the fact that the delivery sector has ballooned, and I think I made the comment, it's like, get your butt off the couch, walk or drive to the store. You don't need to order everything and have it delivered to your door. But I know that's the culture that we're in now, and I don't ever order anything online, but I know a lot of people do. I don't know.
You leave him alone.
I think my neighbors are keeping It's like every day they have some sort of delivery company. So that, yeah, but that's another. It's a good point too. It's like, you know, the constant deliveries. You know, with the increased necessity, the more delivery trucks. That's also something that's competing. You know, with everything else. You know, that's in the right.
Should we move on to the next section? Does
Yeah,
that
let's
seem?
go
I
ahead.
think there's plenty of time to comment, but let's move into zoning and density standards. So you've already set up the new residential middle housing zones through the comp plan, generally scaling up to your town center or neighborhood centers, and keeping your kind of the R3, R4 areas with townhouses now higher density. So it's my understanding you've elected, even though you're still a tier 1, you're assuming you're going to be a tier 2 soon, and so you're electing to comply with tier 2. And so looking at those in more detail, these are snips from your comp plan describing, I've taken out a lot of the character of each zone and really focused on the density and the heights in each zone. So R1 and R2 already comply with HB 1110 tier 2 units per lot. And then R3 and R4 exceed tier 2. And then they already all comply with density near major transit stops because none of these zones are within that circle. And so the baseline density is great. So looking at affordable housing densities, you need to require up to 4 units if one is affordable. And so you would need to give a bonus for any affordable housing in the R1 zone up to 4 units. So that's something that you need to do per state law. But R2, 3, and 4 already allow those 4 units and comply with affordable housing provisions. So you don't technically need to add a bonus for those, but I'm going to ask you soon, should there be a bonus offered anyway? Incentivize affordable housing. I think I know which way you're going to head with that based on previous conversation tonight. And then you should also note in the comp plan, you didn't set a maximum density for the R3 or 4. And so a question is, should there be a maximum unit count set for those from which to bonus for affordable housing or other public benefits? So right now it's unlimited. And do you want to give bonuses extra credit for doing more? So let's come back and answer that question. I'm going to keep going for just a second. So then other public benefits. We've talked with Christy and staff just about things like tree retention. You have beautiful trees here. They're so tall and amazing. Building retention, green stormwater infrastructure, pedestrian-oriented design that goes above and beyond whatever the design standards will write are. How auto access and maybe shared driveways, maybe better trash collection, sustainability or accessibility features. And so we would relish any advice on those things. And so as a reminder, what should be bonused? Should you set maximum densities in R3 and R4 and give a bonus for R2, 3, and 4?
What does our environmental impact statement say that we can do? If I remember right, we were kind of limited by sewage capacity.
Yeah, I mean, we made assumptions in the different zones, right, of what was going to be allowed. So it's kind of a density issue, and I think also maybe we've kind of blown out lot sizes per se. If we're going to redo the zoning, I think we need to take a look at that. Our lot sizes are really large and really don't match the new zoning. And so I think that's something for us to consider as well, of kind of, you know, if we're going to cap that lot sizes for actual subdivision, or, you know, do you take care of that? You can also take care of that with just maximum densities as well. But
Why do we regulate it by lot size? Like, could we, like, then you, it's dependent on the size of, like, like if you combine two lots, then suddenly you've like halved the density. And then if you split them, you've doubled the density. Like, is it possible to just say units per acre or something like that? It seems simpler.
Yeah, you can. I mean, there's a couple different ways that we could do that. That's just a discussion point of.
I have an update on that because Tacoma just got their review from Commerce and had made the assumption, and it's written into the code, that they get a certain number of units per lot area. And they set the minimum lot size, figured out what the 4 units would be, divided that by 4 and gave that as the lot size. It did not correspond to the minimum lot size, and Commerce read that. They're actually reading the minimum lot size with the density allowed as paired. And so it's a quick fix for Tacoma, but it does matter when we're considering what the density is. They will weigh that against the minimum or minimum lot size. So even though you have a lot of big lots in certain places, you should still allow, figure out what you want that density to be and set the minimum lot size like that. And we can help you do that.
Yeah, like I think the new state code that they're proposing has like a 6,000 square foot minimum maximum lot size for residential zones, which I think, we can talk about how that maps to our plat, because I think that our 60, sort of 60 foot by 120 foot in the town center is kind of a, the typical thing we have. But then I think that translates to like, 18 units per acre for R2 or for R1, like, or it's either 12 or 18, and then like it jumps up by 6 for each thing. So I think that sounds cleaner to me, but I don't know what everyone else thinks.
Any of our online commissioners have any opinions?
Not yet. Try to take it all in.
It's a lot.
And can you remind me where R3 and R4 are again? I think they were apartment zones, and we just kind of made them R zones because we differentiated between zones that allow a lot of shops and zones that don't allow a lot of shops.
So R3 and R4, you can see in the map, right? The R4 is the darkest orange up in the north, almost exclusively, I believe. And then the R3, there's also some large sites, okay, east and west, and then kind of hugging the town center.
I don't remember, did we have maximum unit counts for those zones before? Back when they were RMM and RML and all the other alphabet soup?
No, we didn't. It was just, based on more on kind of minimum lot size and meeting standards, of, I guess, more of a zoning type exercise of, you need this much buffer, you need this much landscaping, right? You need this much parking. So how much do you fit on a particular piece of property, right? Type of thing. So, and we didn't really, other than those kind of multifamily residential zones, it really wasn't a question, right? For the most part until more recently, but it was like single family, and you could do an ADU if it met this criteria. So, we weren't stretching the code as much as we are going to be now, right? It was pretty basic.
Be interested to see what the current density is in units per acre, if that's easy to get.
Yeah, I
That
think
might
we
help
have some
inform.
of that already in our housing information.
Yeah, that might help inform,
yeah.
like, if we are setting a maximum where we didn't have one before, kind of what does that look like?
That makes sense.
So that's a great point. Does the density in those zones feel right? If we got the densities in R4 and R3 on average, do they feel just about right for what those should be zoned in the future?
I know we spent a lot of time, on this, on the last comp plan. update, and, you know, especially where, you know, you were talking about the, you know, the furthest north part of the city, you know, being R4 almost exclusively. That's because right now those are all, you know, sort of aging garden style apartments, and the hope is that at some point they'll need to be redeveloped, and it's like, well, this is already denser part of the city. It makes sense to, that's where, you know, even more density would go. Plus it's close to sort of our, you know, a commercial node that we're, you know, we're trying to grow as well. And I think that sort of informs the other question that you had about, you know, limits on these R3s and R4s. And I think one of the reasons why we didn't necessarily have a limit is because that's where we want to see the growth. We don't want to discourage any of their growth. And because we are kind of butting up against that infrastructure capacity that sort of hamstrung us during this process, because I think it would be fair to say we're more aggressive with what we wanted to see in certain areas, and we were basically told we got to slow our roll. we don't have the resources to actually be able to service those goals. And you know, that's a conversation for the future in terms of, you know, especially when it came to water and sewer capacity. That was the big sticking point, is that we didn't have the ability to provide those services if we were to have the level of density that we wanted to see. So the idea was, okay, well, we definitely want to have the density focus in those specific areas as much as possible. And then as, you know, really encourage it there. And then as it tears down when it gets to the, you know, the R2 and especially the R1. So I don't know if, you know, by putting a limit that said would trigger, that bonus, then I don't know how that would sort of play out, because I don't know if we necessarily want to limit that, because it's kind of an artificial limit to trigger the you know, affordable density where we'd be like, oh, we want as much density as possible there anyway. So then it just sort of, I guess, up to the developer whether or not it's affordable.
And to be clear, you don't have to bonus from just density. You could add a floor area bonus, right? If you give more floor area for affordability or tree retention or whatever,
And
then that's still a bonus.
I saw that on your list, and I know that is, and we kind of talked about it earlier too, is just the lot coverage is becoming an issue, because as we see more of these full tear down developments, as opposed to just, keeping the existing house and maybe throwing a little bit extra on the property, we're losing our tree cover. So if I'd love to be able to say, hey, keep as much yard as possible, keep that tree, we'll let you go up a little bit higher.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'd rather see taller buildings than bigger buildings on the site. I would be interested to know what the assumptions were for the redevelopment of the R3 and R4. Because if we do, like, you know, I think those existing buildings are, you know, they're garden style apartments, which I like because they're, like, you know, a bit more family friendly than like a 5/1 or whatever. You know, I also think they're probably not as dense as the zoning may lead people to believe. So if we do wind up imposing a limit that is something different, like a unit limit that is different than the assumptions that were made in the environmental impact statement, does that then free up sewer capacity and water capacity to then distribute some of those units elsewhere in the town? Like, can we then allow more affordability density bonus in other zones? That's something I'd be interested to know.
Don't have an answer to that yet. But.
Yeah, I figured it's probably going to be a question, because I think that my sense is there's probably a game that's played with, like, you know, do we push here and does that free up some capacity over here or something?
I also think you got to think about kind of conceptually what you guys talked about, which is we're trying to grow on multimodal transportation routes, and we're trying to grow from a core out. So if it's kind of one size fits all, then are you really structurally getting to what your whole concept was, which is we're developing around these neighborhood core nodes, and we're encouraging that there, and maybe not so much here right now, because this is where we want it, almost like the town center. You know, it's kind of the center of the community, but if you can just do it anywhere, then we kind of have, I guess, what we currently have, which is there's no there, right? So I think we got to be really careful to think back on the other things as well that we kind of based our land use assumptions on.
And I think there's a couple of other things I think that should be incentivized. One is stormwater retention. The more stormwater you retain on the site and treat, if you do things like green roofs, you could, you know, that sort of ameliorates some of the site restrictions. I think from an environmental standpoint, it makes sense to allow that kind of bonus, because the reason of restricting, like a big reason of restricting site is to try to reduce like runoff and you know, water pollution and flood waters and things like that. The other thing that I think will probably wind up being more of a factor in R3 and R4 is if there are community facilities that are part of the development, or if we allow commercial development within those zones. I know it's a bit more of a town center thing, but we do have a lot of these, you know, especially the R4s on these arterials. And like, you know, we talk about transit as kind of being the rationale behind why we did that, but I don't think it's really like being next to a busy road doesn't actually make the building better. But being like having a commercial space on the road might actually, like there might actually be some benefit to that. So I think bonuses for community facilities and public facing things and third place businesses or whatever we have, like I think that makes sense as well.
I would add one qualification on that, and we see that not only in our jurisdiction but in other jurisdictions where the development finds a loophole and they use that ground space for quote unquote public space, but it's the gym for the building, or it's the cafeteria for the senior center that technically they're saying is open to everybody, but nobody views it that way, and so it really is just privatized space on that. It always frustrating every time I see a new taking advantage of that loophole. I know we closed up some of that loopholes in our city a while back, but I know as code kind of gets redone, those loopholes somehow inadvertently can always find their way back into code. And I would just make sure that we are clear that when we say ground floor public facing, that it truly is a public commercial space and not something that is restrictive only to the tenants. They can have that space, but just don't put it on the ground floor facing the sidewalk.
One thing I would just add really quickly, I've heard from a lot of you, I think I've heard from a lot of you about pedestrian connectivity. Seems like that would be maybe one of the things that you would want to add on the list, is maybe looking at some bonuses for improving that. Am I correct?
Talking about streetscape development, or are we talking about like some of these sites where you might have like a cut through or something?
Yeah,
and then
I
you're
think
delivering-
both,
yeah.
you know, potentially examining those things of where you're kind of going above and beyond a little bit to provide, you know, we have a lot of north-south connection. We lack east-west and, you know, people being able to circulate through the community effectively without going all the way to the end of the block or whatever. That if we can encourage some of that as part of somebody developing and wanting to do it and getting a bonus, that seems like one of the things that we've kind of strived for the last several years.
Yeah, I think that's good. It helps, the rationale being that it helps reduce demand on the sort of auto-focused transportation system we have. And then I think I may have mentioned already, tree bonuses make a lot of sense, like working with people who are working very hard to preserve trees that are already on the site that are large. That makes a lot of sense. I'd be interested to hear what comes back as like feasible, because I imagine big trees especially are probably a bit of a challenge to work around on some of these sites. And then, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, green building standards. I think building for the future makes a lot of sense.
Should we move on to ADUs or, oh, I heard somebody unmuting.
I think we can move.
No, I don't have anything. I think I had a thought, but I lost it, so I'm just listening now.
Okay, well, we were talking a little bit about ADUs earlier. These are the HB 1337 rules for ADUs. You have to allow at least 2 ADUs on any lot. They can be between 1,000 square feet and up to 2,000 to count as an ADU. Have to allow at least 24 feet of height and allow garage conversions, even if the existing garage doesn't currently meet code. And you can't impose street improvements. Parking is also regulated, can't require any within half mile of transit. And you can't have more, or you can't require more than 1 stall if the lots are less than 6,000, and you can't require more than 2 if the lot is greater than 6,000. Of course, developers can build what they want, or homeowners can add what they want, but those are the minimums. So specifically for Mountlake Terrace, you can choose to count ADUs towards density. And if you didn't, you'd be essentially adding the required 2 ADUs on top of the density of the R1 and R2, if that's where you're keeping density. And so I'm wondering if that feels like the right approach. And then also we brought up that some existing homes are much smaller than even the ADU threshold of 1,000. And so the question is, should they count as ADUs in Mountlake Terrace? And the advantage of that for people building something else on the lot would be that maybe the parking or street improvements would be waived for them because of the state law. So those are the questions about ADUs.
Yeah, that 1,000 foot to 2,000 square foot stands out to me right away, because that's bigger than my house. That's crazy. The fact that, like, say somebody wants to add an ADU onto their, on their property, but they want something modest. That's like 500 or even 800 square feet. The fact that that wouldn't even count towards this, it would have to be 1,000. I mean, when you're 1,000 square feet, that's.
You know what? I didn't say this right. You can count an ADU as something that's up to 1,000, but you can also choose to go to 2,000. So it can be smaller. I'm sorry. This is a bad bullet point.
Okay.
But yeah, so you can kind of set your ADU range up to 1,000 or 2,000. But no, I'm wrong.
We
cannot
can't
go less than 1,000.
Correct.
You can't go less than
Well,
1,000.
somebody could build less than 1,000, but we can't regulate to say, like we do now, which is 60% of the size of your current home up to a maximum of 800 square feet. We can't do that anymore. Somebody can come in and say, I would like to build 1,000 square foot ADU, and we have to change our regulations. Right now, we have ownership regulations. We have all kinds of things in our accessory dwelling units. No longer, it's against state law. We have to allow at least up to 1,000 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit. If I want to come in and say, I want to do 400 square feet, great, perfect. But I can't say, nope, 1,000 square feet, too big, or over the 60% like we have right now. So like Heidi's saying, we can choose between 1,000 and 2,000 square feet as our maximum size. you know, of where that wants to land. But,
Can we regulate lot coverage still?
yeah, we sure can.
Okay, because like I'm just like imagining like if this was my lot
Mhm.
and I were to come and say, hey, I want to put 1,000 square foot ADU in my backyard. That's like doubling the house, you know,
Sure.
the lot coverage on my lot. That's really wiping out a lot of open space.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen this though, where we have the smaller homes in Mountlake Terrace, right? That were built all pretty much post World War II. And so a lot of people have done the existing house as the accessory dwelling unit and then built a bigger house in the rear.
Have they?
I mean, that's happened.
Has those been the cases though, where the bigger house is then redesignated as the primary and the existing is now the ADU?
Correct, yeah. Yep. Yeah, it hasn't been traditional, you know, of where, you know, we all have concepts in our head like, oh, I have a house and then I put the ADU in the backyard, right? We're seeing that that's not necessarily all the case unless you have prohibited that in the past, but now you can see that there's new regulations which the whole idea is trying to allow for more of these accessory dwelling units in communities, right? Which is allegedly affordable housing, but it's not counted as affordable housing.
As part of your guys' study and analysis, do you look at where, and I guess this would just be under the assumption that the original house is staying, it's not a tear down, and there's additional development happening on the lot, where that original development is sited within the lot itself? Because I know some of our lots, you know, the original house is a lot closer to the street, creating a huge, you know, a deeper backyard that allows it, versus kind of like where I'm at, where the house is more in the center. And so if you were to plop down basically another house in the backyard, there's no backyard anymore. There are cases where you might be able to put something of larger size in quote unquote the backyard, and there isn't as much impact versus lots where there is most definitely a significant impact. And I don't know how the state bill sort of hamstrings us in saying it's allowed here but not allowed here, or if even looking at that makes any difference. I don't know.
It doesn't matter. I mean, like Heidi said, there is a thou shall provide at least, you know, whether you can physically do it or not on your piece of property, that's a whole nother story. But regulatory wise, we can't say, nope, I'm sorry. We have to allow it by code, but then there's the practical matter of everybody's lot's different and where their original home is placed. Some people may be able to do an accessory or accessory dwelling unit that's attached, but I can't do some detached because I've got steep slopes on my property or this or that. But the whole idea is right now that we have to provide in zoning we have to provide to allow for this, right? Whether you can do it or not is a different thing.
And you can still set setbacks that are reasonable, that they have to fit within, and even building separation rules.
Which are pretty minimal.
So to clarify, the 1,000 and 2,000 bullet point, is that saying that the maximum that you can impose is 1,000?
Yeah, the minimum that it's saying that we have to allow at least up to 1,000 square foot
The minimum.
accessory dwelling unit as a minimum. We can increase that. So, I think that's giving at least some flexibility to consider based on your community, right? And in our case, we have a lot of smaller homes in our community than maybe other places.
So,
And you can't allow larger than 2,000. Is that also what it's saying?
Correct.
Okay.
So no giant regular size house ADUs. So there's also, with accessory dwelling unit, there's an idea that there is sort of a primary dwelling unit that is larger, that's sort of baked into the assumptions of our current code, which I think the minimum size is like 200 or 250 square feet for an ADU, and then the maximum is like 800, but it's 40% of the primary dwelling unit. But it sounds like we can't make them lopsided anymore, right?
Yeah, we got to take away that 60% threshold or up to 800 square foot threshold. Or we require home occupants, homeowner live in the primary structure. We can't do that anymore. So here's the new rules that we're going to need to work within for these accessory dwelling units.
So you could take a blocker and then add 2 other blockers, and then they would be a primary dwelling unit and then 2 dadus, but there wouldn't, it's more of an artificial administrative thing. It's not like, there's one unit that is clearly like the primary dwelling.
Essentially, yeah, except you're probably not going to build 2 blockers anymore just because of building code.
Thank God. How out of code can garage conversions be? They have to be able in a foundation, right? So I think this is like the starter house of Seattle, right? Like they build all these they take the original house and they build like a ADU and a dadu, and then they sell them for like $500,000 or something. And they're pretty popular, but I think 1,000 square feet tends to be too small for a family size house, which in my mind, the market seems to say is like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath.
I think that's where maybe we need to question our conventional wisdom of what is that right fit. So if I'm a single person, if I'm a young married couple trying to get into a house as my starter, do I necessarily need 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms? At some point when you require a certain threshold, you're basically lifting it out of an affordable price range.
Right, but we're talking about maximums, not minimums, right? So you can still build smaller, but then you can allow it to be built bigger. I think sort of in my mind, we shouldn't be restricting an ADU from holding a small family, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's, your guys's.
Yeah. And I think, these smaller ADUs, maybe 250 or 500 square feet, I could see maybe there being a way of incentivizing those a little bit. Does it really make sense if your ADU is the size of an accessory building to restrict it from the being in the front or backyard setback? Could a short building comfortably live closer to the property line? Short, small, I don't know, just random thought, but because I do think these wind up becoming cottage communities, but 3 very quickly, and then so do we start that. I think to Commissioner Chair Batista's point, these are awkward. They sort of make very weird spaces when you take one unit and you make a bunch of them. And I think for quality and for longevity, it makes more sense if we can have a logical progression of space from public to semi-public to private, if we're creating these as almost cottage communities, which, and then the boundary starts getting blurry as well, too, if you're putting 2 ADUs on a lot and then the 3rd dwelling. So, which is why I think the code is complicated. But that said, I think the 1,000 square foot minimum is probably a little too small.
You mean maximum?
Yeah, the maximum minimum. The minimum maximum.
So
Minimum, maximum.
Yeah.
So just for consideration, and you guys, you're in charge here, but every time a structure gets larger, it gets more expensive. And so, I mean, I think the premise behind accessory dwelling units is to limit that size. And it's understand that people want housing, they want, you know, people to purchase a home and be able to purchase a home, but not everybody's going to be able to purchase a home either. So the larger you get, the more the cost of the unit, the more the cost of the rent. So when we're thinking about a variety of housing types and we're trying to think of everybody, is 3 bedrooms, 2 bath, the end all be all? Just something to think about.
Make it lopsided. Could you make one ADU a certain size and another ADU another certain size?
As long as you're allowing at least a minimum of 1,000 square feet.
If you made one 1,000, another 1,200, that would give your extra bedroom.
I know we have to come up with a solution based off of current state mandates. Correct me if I'm wrong, this House bill for the ADUs, this is what, is that this year or was this passed last?
Last year.
Last year, okay.
Yeah.
Do we know, has there been a lot of pushback from the jurisdictions on this? And there might be any kind of amendment in the near term, here in the near future?
I think there's been pushback, and I don't believe that we've seen any amendments to this thus far.
Obviously, if this changes and some of these numbers are reduced, especially must allow it to be this high and must allow it to be this large of a square footage, if those get reduced, I would definitely want to see her adjust to that. Because I think, I don't think of things this large when I use, I'm sorry.
So some of these examples, like the middle one, goes up to probably 30 feet at least, and you only need to allow 24 feet. The one on the one on the left and the right, a little shorter. Right? One of them looks a little bigger, one of them looks really small.
Okay, so the height limits are also a factor here. Makes sense.
Am I hearing maybe keep that limit to 24 and for DADUs or ADUs?
Like 25 is more in line with the logic of the code, but yeah. I mean, it seems like, and this is also where, like, you know, what is the difference between this and a duplex or a triplex?
Shared walls.
You put a little like closet in between the two separate houses.
I know for me, my concern on height is more when it's an accessory structure. If they wanted to throw an ADU on top of the existing structure, I don't have as much of a problem with that, especially because as like if I was the neighbor and like say I'm looking out at my backyard and I'm enjoying my poor man's attempt at an English style garden. You know, you look out, you kind of see the wide expanse. On your periphery, you're not necessarily seeing huge buildings on, you know, bookending you because they're directly adjacent to you. You know, the height isn't impacting you as much. Same if you're kind of looking out at the front yard. So the height on the existing building, that does not bother me, but it's when you're throwing the building in the backyard, now all of a sudden that's the backyard's a building. There is no yard. And I know that even though you'll say developers, oh, people don't want any yards anymore, people want, you know, if they wanted to live in an apartment or, you know, a more dense environment, they would. And in this case, the house is more expensive. They could afford the house. They're picking that house. That's the housing style they want. I know from what I've heard, you know, just people squawking over the years, especially when they find out I'm on the planning commission. That's their biggest gripe is that the neighborhood characteristic. Obviously, it evolves and changes over time anyway, but that is such a stark contrast to what they thought they were buying into. And it was not on their radar, and they had no idea that was going to happen. And it is a big shock. And I, like I said, I see it every day, my job in Seattle, but I've also seen people that I know who live in the suburbs, seeing happen to them, and they're just like, what the F is this? This is like how, and I could, like they look out their backyard one day and they just, it's crazy. And I'm sure it's a conversation that you've heard, in every jurisdiction. So I'm very sensitive to, that type of development, coming in. I know that by law we have to allow it, but I think we need to take into consideration, the impact of that. And it's like, okay, we can allow it. What is the best way we can allow it? And what is the way that maybe we should encourage it versus just, sort of it being the wild, wild west of, oh, well, our hands are tied. We'll just let you do whatever we want, whatever you want.
Okay, that's helpful.
Possibly a very basic question. We allow 6-foot tall fences. Could we allow 8-foot tall fences? It would screen the ground floor from some of these.
I know that might be more of a fire consideration in terms of emergency access, but I agree. I think what we're going to start seeing is a request for more buffering, visual buffering from these, higher fences, taller plant life, a lot of arborvitaes, whatever that homeowner can do to try and shield out the new visual impediment that is adjacent to them. I expect we will see those type of requests come in. And if they don't come in, I suspect they'll be happening anyway. Just imagine how many fences get replaced in the city without a permit. A lot of people aren't asking for permission to begin with.
Well, we don't require a permit anymore, actually.
Really?
No.
Oh, really? Okay, well.
That was about a year ago, so. But I mean, it's 6 foot in the rear and then the front yard setback, it's 4 feet for fences currently.
I'll have the barbed wire guy come out and look. Yeah, I think that gets back to the whole like logical progression of space from public to semi-public to private, and then when that's interrupted on the lot, like it's a design consideration, and I have no idea how you regulate that in these cases, which maybe you have some magic there, but that is a complaint I've heard from the public as well.
Okay, this is super helpful. We have 15 minutes left, so let's talk about scale a little bit. Or the standards that control the scale of individual buildings on a lot, which we've been talking about a little bit. So floor area ratio, the ratio of building area to site area, is a very common method for controlling scale of development. Maybe less so in residential zones, but certainly in more zones as you step up. Controlling lot coverage, as we've just discussed, or percentage of building footprint to lot footprint, is also common. And so in the examples on this page, all the building masses represent a 0.5 FAR. You can stack that area into 1, 2, or 3 stories with really different results for the lot coverage, as we just discussed. Here they vary from 50 to 20 and 16.6. On bigger lots, that same 0.5 FAR does a different job of controlling the scale of the buildings. They can get the buildings in this example are a little larger, bordering on being out of character with single family fabric. And sometimes creating a maximum building width or depth can control the scale of buildings on a site to be more in keeping with surrounding single family scale. You've been getting at this already tonight. And can help maintain a rhythm of side yards and landscaping similar to single family housing, or avoid buildings looming over backyards. It gets away from the possibility of longer building massings on those larger sites. I'm going to skip these questions, but I will come back to them. And basically, it's going to be questions about what is the best way to regulate scale on Mountlake Terrace. Do you want FAR? Do you want lot coverage? Do you want maximum building widths and depths? So now I'm going to talk about ways to distribute that scale. Okay, so different than how scale is handled on a lot. The left diagram represents that scale or FAR can be I'm using the term scale or FAR because maybe you don't want FAR, but let's just use the term scale. So scale can be distributed relative to the intended uses and the intensity of each zone, as you've talked about, scaling up to your neighborhood centers. In the comp plan, you've already done this, right, with your heights differently. So it makes sense to me that if you do use FAR or some scalar method, that you would scale up to from R1 to R4, as shown on the left. Couple other ways that scale can be allocated. Just because more units are allowed in a particular zone doesn't mean that builders are going to max it out every time in reality. So in zones that allow 6 unit, they may just build 2. So the approach in the middle is a sliding scale that offers more total area when you build more density. This is the Portland approach. You get more FAR for 6 units than you do for 1 unit. This has the effect of allowing you to set a large enough FAR for the 6 units while also ensuring that somebody won't build an oversized single-family house that is the same size as a 6-plex. Another way to allocate scale is by housing type. You can offer more FAR for the types you'd like to see or that are harder to make pencil. And as Mackenzie was talking about, sometimes it's the stacked flats or cottage housing or small apartment buildings that are harder to do. And we'll be studying that soon. Note the numbers up here are random, or not random. You could allocate them however you see fit. Okay, so the question here is whether you think more FAR should be offered FAR or scale should be offered for having more units, or would you like to incentivize certain housing types over others? And then confirming you would like to scale up per zone. So those are the 3 questions about this. And as a reminder, the other questions are how would you like to control scale at all? Turn it back to you. It would be great to, what do we do in Mountlake Terrace when we have more content than we can get through film?
Well, I mean, it's up to you guys, but, we typically, the chair would ask if, they want to go over, if you guys could go over a little bit. So, I mean, it's kind of up to you as to, and I mean, we can shorten the rest of our meeting to get to this if you think, it takes another 15 or 20 minutes or whatever, then that's okay, if that works for you guys.
Well, why don't we talk about the scale? What's remaining and what we wanted to talk about is really the overall organizational framework and how you would like to handle design guidelines. We could probably wait or accept comments about that later, but I can stay a little later if you'd like.
I would say if you would like to have 9 be your stopping point and there's a little bit left over and you don't mind coming back to us with the leftover, that's fine. If you feel that it's possible, like the 9 o'clock cutoff is not an issue, at least for me as the chair. Maybe others disagree. So if you need to go over 9 o'clock, that is fine with me. But if you feel like 9's a good stopping point for you and you can come back later with the rest of it and you can do that, that's fine as well. So I'll kind of leave it up to you. So don't feel that you're bound by that 9 o'clock timeline. It's not like we have a lot of other stuff on our agenda anyway. It's just a report. So this is pretty much the only thing we're dealing with tonight. So if you'd like to take the opportunity to go over 9 o'clock, that's fine with me. Okay.
Why don't we hear what you think about scale and how to set it and how to distribute it, and then maybe we'll make a decision if we want to table the rest.
Or maybe add it to the 24th, potentially, for the housing action plan.
We're going to be in a position where we can't wait because you don't have time left. And we could bring a couple. Maybe we bring a couple up.
Okay.
Okay. So, how would you like to set scale? Do you want to have FAR, etc.?
Lot coverage times stories is FAR, right? So we currently have 40% lot coverage, 3 stories. So we have a current FAR of 1.2.
That was some pretty fast math, but they're definitely related. Yeah,
Yeah.
they absolutely are related when you,
Yeah.
unless
Maybe-
you're counting impervious surface. If you're just counting building footprint, then it's related.
I think that's how our zoning currently is, sort of how I've imagined these other things going forward. I think it makes sense to talk about FAR in terms of incentives, like if you're trying to provide less lot coverage and the trade-off is more height or something like that, I think that makes sense. But if we're already regulating it and then we regulate FAR in addition to lot coverage and number of floors, I could see how that might work. But it also might be a little complicated. Maybe if you have incentives for putting buildings towards the front of the lot as opposed to like kind of the back of the lot, and you don't have, you know, the 3-story ADU that's like got a 400 square foot base. You know, it's like 3 stories, a room on each floor. You know, I think that kind of makes sense. But I do think lot coverage and number of stories makes FAR more of a discussion point for incentives rather than like the basic starting point of regulations, is my opinion.
I know for me, especially if we're talking about a situation where we're probably going to see more height in certain circumstances here, I definitely want to see as much setback requirement as possible to allow as much daylighting as possible. Doesn't do any good to have a yard and try and encourage open space if it never sees sunlight. You'll never get anything to grow. It'd just be a dirt patch. And you know, I know we have front, rear, and side yard setbacks right now. I would not want to see those reduced. Don't know if we want to even see some of those increased if we're talking about more height. Be curious to see what how other people think, or maybe it's you guys kind of do your homework and come back to us and said this is what would end up happening if it's this is what would end up happening if it's that, and if it's this, it's not even feasible. And
I think front yard setbacks are a little bit useless. Like people kind of like it when the houses are built closer to the street and they're smaller scale. Like you walk around older neighborhoods and like the scale of everything is just a lot smaller. So I think if we were to look at setbacks, like the backyard setback is probably the most important.
Mhm.
And then the side yard setbacks, like I think, you know, at a certain point, the building code takes over in terms of how many windows you can put on there. And like when you build it within 3 feet of the property line, like, you know, you just have a blank wall, which I think people might actually prefer to having a whole bunch of windows looking down their rooms. So I don't know. I question whether side yard setback is the best way to regulate that, or maybe it's something like window open area or something. And then I don't know if it's on this slide, but I think when I looked through your slides earlier, you had something about the orientation of the door and the building. Like, I think that's actually a pretty important one. So whether you're oriented to the street or whether you have this like transitional zone on the lot where you're oriented into some kind of common area in the lot, I think is a critical distinction, because it's about how that building and that development meets the surroundings. I don't know what the regulation looks like, but I do think that's probably a threshold. And then building widths and depths, like for bigger zones, I do want to see a limit on building widths to like the size of a city block. Like we've got a bunch of like bigger developments that are just too wide and you can't really walk around them. It's a bad urban scale. Building depth could be an interesting one to regulate, because when the buildings start getting too big and square, they start having complicated interior layouts where you don't really have a lot of windows. So I don't know if that's as much of an issue at this scale of development, but that is something that I think would be interested in looking at.
I would just add that setbacks vary depending on the building type that you're doing, right? Single family is very different than, you know, if we're doing courtyard apart, you know, if we're trying to encourage other things, I think we need to consider that each building type is going to be distinct, and it's not necessarily going to fit into that 15-foot front yard setback, 20 feet in the rear, you know, or 15 feet in the rear, 5 feet in the sides, kind of a thing, right? I mean, there's building requirements, and we can get into that are going to really set those minimums, but they're pretty minimum when we're talking about a lot of stuff, right? But I think depending on if we truly want to see a different type of development other than townhomes and single-family dwellings, then, you know, there's different approaches to each of those. Much like, I think building heights, depending on what you're building. For instance, our conversation on accessory, you know, typically we have building heights, you know, 30 to 35 feet in a R1 or a residential zone, but maybe you want to be less than that if you're talking an accessory dwelling unit or just that additional impact. So there's, you know, maybe different ways that we can get to the same, you know, endpoint that make a lot of sense.
Yeah, or even the back half of the lot, like, you know, I think there's the images going around of like, the way they do development in Europe, and it's like, you know, the building is located on the entire front half of the lot. The FAR is like 2 because it's like 4 stories of building, and there's no front or side yard setbacks. But then the entire backyard is just sort of this like courtyard, right?
Right.
And like, I could see us wanting to encourage something like that, where you bring the buildings more towards the street. And then like in the front half of the lot,
Right.
you sort of control views and things like that. And the back
Sure.
half of the lot is more of like, it fits in better with the sort of private elements
Yeah.
for this kind of zone, not necessarily all.
I would love to hear if people think we should use FAR. And in all zones or some zones, it's definitely something we can bonus to. If you don't want FAR, we should talk about what kind of bonus you would give for saving trees and affordable housing and things like that.
So from a mechanical perspective, is floor area ratio going to be very close to lot coverage times number of stories, like every time? Like, because if I'm using Adam's example, you know, he kind of backed into it saying 40% times 3, 1.2 makes sense to me. So if that relationship does hold true, then it's kind of a moot question, because it's already, you know, you can exception it. So I like your idea that if you have more units, maybe you get higher coverage ratio, you know, or to differentiate single family versus like 4 duplexes on a lot. But it just seems like if that statement holds true, there's no need to add complications to the vernacular just because there already is.
It is true, but you cannot go lower than 3 stories.
In terms of maximum,
Is it,
is that what we're talking about? So we would have a disconnect between FAR and lot coverage times building height.
because you have to allow 3 stories. And then the ADUs have to be at least 2.
You have to allow 2 stories.
So you don't have the same ability to squish height down, lot coverage out like you do with, like FAR does that automatically.
Right. Right. If you have uneven heights, FAR comes into play because you can't just do lot coverage.
It's a good, so I can think about this a little bit more and how we would use it.
Mhm.
Am I hearing FAR is not a tool you're interested in?
Not necessarily. It was more of a question that if it's redundant, no need. But if it's not redundant, then let's see.
Yeah, I'd want to know how we're advantaging, like what advantage do we get from using it? I think I'm not totally clear on that.
Yeah, it seems more complex, but maybe it's.
How about our online commissioners? Any questions, comments, opinions?
I think Adam just hit it. I'm not quite sure what I'm getting, like choosing FAR versus the other. I mean, I guess need more information.
I would agree with that as well. I'd love to see, I don't know, some like real world examples and things that I'm like this is super great to see these, but I almost want to see like it in,
Mm.
I guess just real world examples where I can like see it in action.
Yeah, it sounds like this might be a tool that that could potentially address some of our concerns about building massing and orientation and things like that. That is beyond this, but I think I'm personally struggling to see how adding FAR then changes things like setbacks and number of stories and things like that. But if there are thoughts about how those might address some of the concerns we've expressed tonight, I think that could be a potential future valuable direction of discussion.
Great. Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful.
I think what would probably be helpful too is, well, the sort of the standard examples that you have here for FAR, they're helpful. If you're kind of able to take a sample size of what our actual lots are in the city and kind of use that as the base, so we can kind of see this would be the real world application of this on our standard lot. And the lot sizes, kind of change depending on what part of the city that you're looking at. So, maybe take a sample by the, closer to the transit center versus kind of closer to the, up into the north, around. I think it would be helpful to see it real world application of that, just so we can get a.
That's great. We're doing test fits like tomorrow.
Okay.
And showing kind of 10 different housing types and configurations on a more typical, well, 2 typical lots, standardized lots. So you'll be able to visualize that. This is just getting us started on what you're interested in or not interested in seeing. So I think I've heard enough that maybe, but maybe not. Maybe we just want to use lot coverage. Great. Okay. I've heard distributing by zone probably makes sense if there's some scalar measurement. I've heard by density may make sense. Is there do you want to incentivize certain housing types over others? And maybe you just need data about what's more feasible before you know, but are you interested in possibly keeping some different incentives for different housing types?
Sounds like we have some interest in disincentives for things like ADUs, and cottage communities are trying to limit the size. So we don't just have 3,000 square foot house with 2,000 square foot ADUs. I would be interested to see sort of what the struggles and advantages of each of these housing types are before talking about incentives.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see what, kind of is feasible first, because I know in the past, and it sticks out for me because I'm the one who pushed it, pushing for more height in zoning to try and encourage, developers to take advantage of that, and just for developers to completely ignore it and give us the same better 5/1s that they've penciled out and Excel sheeted cost benefit analysis to death. So I'm all for seeing new ideas, but it doesn't make sense to go down the rabbit hole and try and legislate something that we realistically probably never see.
Okay, this is really helpful, and we don't have to have everything figured out yet. It's just really great to hear how you're thinking about it. So I am going to propose, I'm just going to present maybe the organizational framework. We can, you can choose to comment on it as much as you want, and let's see where this goes. I'll do it fairly quickly. So, as you know from your code, it gets wonkier as we go, FYI. So codes are usually made up of conventional zoning standards, like all the things we've been talking about, maximum heights, minimum setbacks, sometimes step backs from lower facades, and together they make up the zoning envelope, which we've been talking about and worried about a little bit here. It's that imaginary form that a building has to fit into. Sometimes houses fill their entire zoning envelope, but often they don't. In Mountlake Terrace, we know they don't, and oftentimes the older houses don't. But as you add more units, in the case of middle housing, there will be more pressure to fill up that envelope. We've been talking about that. So you have to carefully consider these, and we'll use the conventional zoning code part in the R zones to control that envelope and use and lot size, those kind of things, right? We're familiar with this. We are also planning to use complementary design standards that regulate the look and feel of buildings and outdoor space, with guidelines for the things we talked about: entry orientation, modulation or articulation, how many ins and outs, the percentage of openings on the facade, and other architectural moves. And these aim to continue the patterns and character that make a place unique. So organizing the code in two complementary sections is complementary with how you already do your town center zones. But you have a choice on how the design standards are tailored to middle housing, either making them general to all the development in the R zones, or defining or tailoring them to the housing types you would like to do. I said it was going to get wonky, so I see everybody like, okay, I think I get this. So next couple slides. So doing general design standards may allow more flexibility overall, right? Because we don't know what people might want to design, but they may have less predictable outcomes. They also don't lend themselves to controlling specific issues that arise with certain types. So an example would be the tree. So on some of the townhouses that you get that go way deep into the lot and they have a long driveway, and the driveway is so dominant and they're one after the other, you could really regulate that with some design standards very specifically. Okay, so housing or design guidelines by housing types allow more predictable outcomes for the housing types and more specific guidance. So in that example, you could say you need to have a certain width of the housing and you have to screen the driveways for part of them, or something, some standard. Sometimes doing this, it's easier to understand for developers and architects and lay people, but they can be a little less flexible, right? Because they're kind of, we're trying to envision something that someone's going to design. Just observing lots of codes in residential areas that are trying to do a little bit of middle housing, like cottage housing here and ADUs, and your code already starts to add some of these housing types. So you've got general, and then you add the cottage, and then you add the ADU, and you add whatever. And so the question that would be great to get to, because we have very little time to write the code, is, do you have a preference about how we would organize those standards? Would you like to see something that's more specific to types that you want to do, or something more general to allow for more flexibility? I kind of recommend going with the housing type, but we haven't, I don't know that we have a strong opinion on what those types should be from the earlier conversation. And so that would be that's my last question tonight, if you have thoughts on it.
I think the more variability of house structure that you can have on a lot, then the more inclined I would be to say that it should be like a general holistic one instead of by house type, because you're not guaranteed that conformity anyway if you can build an SFR next to a triplex next to a cottage. So it really depends, I think, like how strict is the structure type and zoning. If that's strict, then you could probably do it with the housing type because it'll conform anyway. And I do think that conformity is, from my opinion at least, a general value boost. I was raised in Houston where there's no zoning laws. It looks terrible. Like, it's very ugly for many reasons, but largely because of zoning, because you're going to have a church next to a school next to a strip club. like literally, you would have that. So to the extent that like the zoning controls for conformity already, then I would just do it by like the generalized form instead of by house.
I think, maybe there is some advantage in design standards, but I don't know if I would break them out in the way that the state has broken them out. Like, they seem a bit, like, I can kind of see where they're coming from, but like, they seem a bit both too broad and too general at the same time. Like, the edge cases between them are like, how does one fit to the other? As I think you mentioned in your presentation.
Yeah.
My preference is to give the most flexibility, especially because I think, in a place like here, where like people could invent whole new kinds of housing that like we haven't even thought of yet, right? And it could be really great, but it could also be really bad. But I think, if there is an advantage in doing design standards, I think it would probably be broader than what the state model code has broken up. It would probably relate to things more like, is the building's front door on the ground and most of it on the ground, or is there separation? Is it one building or multiple buildings? Does the door go onto the public right of way, or does it go into some kind of public space? Like, I think these are the kind of design standards that might be more important. And, parking in cars are probably a big one too. Like, we don't necessarily want the entire ground plane taken up with cars. I think, there's parking minimums and things like that that sort of guide that. And so the point at which we start hitting that, I think, is another factor potentially as well. But I don't want to write off housing type design standards because I think maybe there could be an advantage, but my bias is probably towards just like, flexible rules that give flexibility.
I'd like to hear, kind of, since this is kind of a big pivot point, how each of our online commissioners, how they kind of feel on this. And, it's okay if you're unsure, that's fine. But if you are leaning one way or the other, it'd be great to hear.
I am unsure, but I do, from what I'm hearing and reading, I think I would like to see more flexibility in the design standards.
I think I can be swayed either way. I really like the housing type design standards because I think that if we introduce variability into the different zones, then it would be nice to provide more guidance for what we're looking for those types of housing types in the specific zones. But I think it also just depends on how we want to break things down. It's kind of right. It depends on the questions we were asking earlier and how the direction we're going to go. So if as a group we come to a consensus, we're going to go with X, Y, or Z, then maybe more flexibility would make sense. So I think that it just is going to kind of depend how we start to structure things with scale and with incentives and so on and so forth, and how we're going to allow different types in different zones.
And Commissioner Landis or Commissioner Morgan?
I can't get can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. This is Commissioner Landis. I have an incredibly bad answer, which is reasonable flexibility. I think flexibility is important. And I think if we're trying to get things to happen, we need to be flexible. But I think there should be some constraints on that to some degree. I'm not sure how helpful that kind of comment is, but that's my general high level thinking around it.
I get that, actually. I understand it. And yeah.
Anyone else? And at least for me, I think my comments almost closely mirror Commissioner Stenson's comments. I kind of lean more towards the the housing type design standards. For the general design standards, the unique design solutions, you might find a gem in that. Less predictable physical outcomes, you might get a stinker, and then you're stuck with it. And that's a concern with me, especially, at least right now, seeing kind of like at the scale some of our development has happened, again, it being whole block redevelopment as opposed to infill. If that is the trend that continues, and all of a sudden we see whole blocks being designed in a way that we are just cringing and pulling our hair out and being like, no, I want to avoid that as much as possible. So for me, I lean towards the housing type, but again, it's a tough question. You gave us a good
It is
one.
a tough question.
I just want to say we
I
did this
agree.
in Tacoma in 2 years, and maybe this part of the conversation took a year. So there's a reason it's tough. It's a lot. We've just gone through almost everything you need to consider. So it's okay that there's not clear answers, because as was just said, the answer to this is relying on the answer to the first one, and we didn't quite answer the first one, and it's okay. I think we've learned a lot that we can take back and work with staff and try to do a good initial draft from this.
Probably helps that we just did a comp plan cycle, so our
Yeah.
brains are sort of already in that space. And for those of us who've been on a
Mhm.
little bit longer, a recent town center update on top of that. So it helps that the vernacular is sort of familiar to us, but it's still difficult questions
yeah.
to answer.
Right. Anything else you haven't been asked that you want to say?
Anybody have any other outstanding questions, concerns about everything we've talked about so far? I know it's a lot. No worries if you don't have anything right now. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to bring up questions or concerns in the future. Hopefully not too late in the process for you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. Do you want to talk about next steps a little bit, just very quickly, I
Very
guess?
quickly. Yes, I can. So, as you can see, you'll be seeing a lot of us over the next few months. So in 2 weeks, we are coming back, but we're going to focus that session. It will be much shorter. It will just be a briefing mostly about the housing action plan and how we're approaching that and how it will kind of weave together with this process. What we are doing for the development code updates next is, like Heidi said, basically tomorrow we're going to get started on the housing test fits to kind of see how some site layouts might work with different development standards. And we'll be doing the economic feasibility testing. We'll also be doing some community and stakeholder engagement. So for this part, the interviews will focus more on like developer interviews and more on the technical side. But on March 26th, which is 2 weeks from Wednesday, we are going to do a community open house, which we would love if you all could join. You will see materials going out about that shortly. And that'll be focused at a higher level for the public, obviously thinking about, what preferences people might have around how housing looks in Mountlake Terrace for these middle housing types. So then we're going to go back, we're going to draft some code. We're going to meet with you all in mid-April. We will give you some updates about where we're at, and we'll probably be, bringing you some more hard-hitting questions for feedback. We will, after that, meet with City Council, and then in May, we will do one more workshop, hoping you all love what we've brought to you. And then I think May 26th is Planning Commission adoption. And then by June 12th, the City Council needs to adopt it to comply with the Washington state legislation. So it's going to be a fast but fun process.
I know in our recent projects that we've had, staff or other consultants have given us, homework to do and, maybe questions to answer that we submit ahead of time to sort of help with the timeline. Do you think that is something that you guys would maybe want to utilize where I am not necessarily trying to propose additional meetings, though I know in some cases in the past, we've had to do additional meetings, you know, outside of the normal 2-week cycle, just because of the amount of work that we have in the timeline crunch. Do you think that either having additional meetings or short of an additional meeting, having a situation where you guys, through your research, kind of hit a point where there's a couple of outstanding questions that you need answered from us before you can move on, but it would be ideal if you had the answer to those questions before the next meeting, as opposed to having to wait to the next meeting and then everything sort of getting backlogged.
Maybe, yeah, let's see where we get. It's likely.
Okay.
So it's nice to hear you offer that, but yeah, we'll think about it.
Yes.
Work with Christy on it.
Yeah.
Technically, as chair, it's my prerogative, but I am very mindful of the time of my fellow planning commissioners, so I'm not trying to automatically throw additional meetings onto your guys' schedule. So obviously, if it's something that could be, you know, maybe answered in an email, or like, you know, like we had like a spreadsheet before, you know, with some,
Yeah, the documents. Yeah,
some questions
that
and we provided
reviewed.
comments and submitted it to you guys, you know, if that works for you. But if we get to a point, you know, especially further along in the process where it's like, it's a crunch and we really need to have more of the face-to-face, ideally the more advanced time we have to be able to schedule that. Obviously, for public notice reasons, we have, you know, have to have a certain amount of time, lead up time to that, but I think that would be helpful. And I think obviously the fact that we have Zoom Meet, the capabilities now, people aren't able to be here physically, that gives them an option. And or since it's not a public hearing, we don't technically need a quorum as well. So if not everybody can make those additional meetings, whoever we can muster, and people obviously can provide, you know, email comments too. But I'm just throwing it out there, just seeing how short this timeline is and knowing how things get compressed the further along that we are, and that we may need to have that as an option. I'm just sort of putting it out there for everybody. Don't be surprised. Obviously, more meetings aren't exactly at the top of everybody's to-do list, but it might be a necessity, or at least homework, you know, where we're answering questions and emailing them.
Yeah, it's really helpful to know that those things are options.
Yeah, thank you very much for everything tonight. Yeah, it's a lot.
All right. Didn't sound like we had any other additional outstanding questions in regards to this specific topic. Just want to make sure.
The public house on the 26th, that's right there at the City Hall. Is that right?
Yes, so we'll be in this room.
Okay.
Yes, well, we're planning to start sending out materials for that on social media and posting flyers starting, I think, Wednesday, so very soon.
All right. Anyone else? Not hearing or seeing anything. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Want to remind commissioners that, and I'll send you this additional stuff via email, but this Thursday, planning commission work plan and accomplishments to city council, 7 p.m. I'll present for the planning commission, but if anybody wants to be in attendance, that would be great.
Is that for
Thanks
the
for that
director's report?
reminder.
Yeah, I'll just cut it there and I'll give you an update on a couple more things.
Okay. All right. So director's report, any? That was it? That's all you had?
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
send out the other stuff, just where we are on a couple of things, just for your information.
All right. So item number 7, miscellaneous business by call of planning commissioners. Anybody have any miscellaneous business? Any upcoming absences, vacations? I
I
am
should be here.
not hearing or seeing anything. So with that, I'll go ahead and declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.